Barack Obama has gotten some bad press, president of our country, for not showing more sensitivity to the suffering of the people of Japan. He's also gotten himself in trouble for calling a press conference to announce bombing of the nation of Libya while he was in another country. We are now at war in 3 Arabic nations. And this last one was done without the consent of Congress and has placed more American soldiers in harm's way without any sense of democratic discussion of what we're doing. So keep an eye on that one. When it comes to Japan, this is one of our key allies that is now going through one of the most horrendous moments in its history. And we're standing back, and the people that are offering the most aid are people of faith. And it's not on the news radar. I love that. It's fascinating to see what's happening. This morning, I was in Starbucks over in Orange County meeting with an editor from the Orange County Register, and this guy across the table, we were talking about the future of journalism, and this guy just broke in and he said, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to tell you guys, I'm where you guys are, but I work with Saddleback. And he said, on this laptop right here, I am coordinating Facebook and Twitter content aimed at Japan. He said, right now I'm just kind of biding my time because it's 12:30 in the morning and they're not awake right now. But he said, what you guys are doing, we're doing to help people over there. So we're going to talk about how suffering is perceived in Japan. And I want you to put this on the back of your mind to write about during your takeaway today. And it's this. I want you to be thinking about suffering. Suffering. And the fact that in this country, suffering has a completely different perception than it does in Japan. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences. And your book specifically mentions a crisis moment in 1995 in Japan that kind of helped to focus attention. Okay, your book talks about victims and victimizers. Victim, I do not know any Japanese. I won't even try to speak a sentence in Japanese, but your book says that the word for victim is higaisha. I probably totally butchered that word. The word for victimizer is kagaisha. And what the chapter is suggesting is that people in Japan think of their world in terms of who are the victims and who are the victimizers. Who is suffering and who caused that suffering. One thing we'll look at in a minute is the fact that in Japan, the majority culture's domination and subjugation of tribal cultures looked very similar to what we did in this country with tribal cultures. You are sitting in land that was taken from people. Twice, actually. At first, it was owned by Native Americans who owned this continent. Anthropologists suggest that those people groups may have had connections with Asia and may have walked across the Bering Strait into Alaska. They were pushed out of their native lands. This area was known at one time as Mexico. Now it's California. In Japan, there were tribal cultures that had a history in Japan that were pushed out. And we'll look at those in a minute. Reverence for ancestors and ancient religious traditions are still part of Japanese culture, but they're just culture. They're not real religion. Just like in this country, if you go to Washington, D.C., you see monuments in tribute to a time in this country when we revered God. God's name appears on monuments. If you didn't know any better, you'd say, this is a God-fearing country. Well, no, depends which God you're talking about. But there's that sense of history that Japan has, but it goes back thousands of years. And it involves reverence for ancestors. The role of the emperor has been preserved. I don't know if you saw this, but in the last week or two, the emperor of Japan made a public statement to the world that Japan will rise from this moment of devastation. The Japanese people will not be crushed by an earthquake or a tsunami. They will rise. Who said that? This emperor person, which is the Japanese equivalent, I think, of the royal family in Britain. You stop anybody on the street in London and say, who is the Queen Mother? They'll tell you the name. The Queen of England has respect among the British people. She has zero power over the affairs of that country, but she's revered. Media in Japan looks and feels a lot like American media. The reason for that is because after World War II, US forces occupied Japan. And much of what we see in terms of their government and their media looks a lot like what we have here in the United States. It's changed. It's very written in with Japanese tradition. But if you spoke Japanese, I think you would see many parallels. And media in Japan gives a sense of respect to the art of Japan, music of Japan, and drama that's been a historical ritual all the way through Japanese history. Okay, gotta show the clip from The Last Samurai. In the faces you're gonna see here, I want you to look at the sense of suffering that is part of Japanese culture. Japanese tradition emulates discipline, control, and a sense of perseverance through the rigors of what life is all about. This movie describes that. And what's fascinating about this film is that an American learns to understand those traditions. So let me have you watch this. This movie describes the move of Japanese culture from a commitment to tribal traditions to an industrial mindset that said machinery is what drives our lives. That happened in this country as well. And as was the case here in this country, so it was with Japan. Our commitment to the machine, to a large extent, took away our soul. We lost our ability to cling to each other because we believe that machinery is the answer to our success. Women in Japanese culture, and I would suggest that women in any culture bear a burden that men have no understanding of. In Japanese culture, there has been the burden of sexual victimization that this film describes. Memoirs of a Geisha. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, obviously, but I want to show you a clip that describes, without words, the depth of what Japanese women feel in this movement from a time when they were respected to where we are today. Women in Japan are different in their role in society to what women are like here in the United States. And I won't presume to know what that's like. First of all, because I'm a guy, and secondly, because I don't understand Japanese culture. But women who have lived there know what this is all about. So let me just play this for you, and in your mind be thinking through what suffering is like in this country and how you see that on the faces on the screen. This is a film about a little girl who grows up in the geisha culture. I actually had to look this up because I didn't know the difference. A geisha is not a prostitute. Okay? It's very important to see the distinction. A geisha in Japanese culture, and this goes back thousands of years, in that culture, geishas were women who were brought into the presence of royalty to bring entertainment to men. Interesting little side note, some of the original geishas were male, not women. There are still male geishas. Geishas were trained to be women of excellence. They were women of beauty, they were women of culture, they were women who could be brought into the presence of people that were of aristocratic power, and they could walk into their presence and they could be part of the entertainment of the rich. This little girl was brought into this culture and said, you can become a geisha, but it's going to be work, and you will suffer as part of what it means to become a true geisha. And in the process of her becoming a geisha, she makes the mistake of falling in love with a man. And so this is the story of breaking that rule. And what you're seeing is a handkerchief that she gets from this man, and she realizes that she can't hold on to this guy. And she goes to the top of a mountain, and she lets the wind blow it from her hand. There's this mystery behind what that means that women in that culture completely understand. In this culture, I don't know if we have something that's quite that same way. Okay, your book talks about media and how Japanese identity speaks to each of these areas. Okay, the emperor I mentioned is part of the tradition. It goes back thousands of years. Is there still an emperor? Yes, there is. He's got a zip code. We know where he lives. He can actually be brought before the cameras and the microphones to make a statement, and he did recently. People of Japan live with the legacy of World War II. Some of them are still angry. Some of them are still living with the guilt of the war crimes that country perpetrated on other countries. There are 2 cities in Japan that were bombed with nuclear weapons. Those cities are still there. We dropped those bombs, and there are people who live to this day with anger and resentment at anyone who would unleash nuclear weapons on them. So that's part of what media wrestle with. The media, if they're smart and contextual, they also bring into stories the fact that the reasons people act as they do has to do with their connection with Shintoism and Buddhism. Your book talks about research showing that a large number of Japanese people would say they are Shinto in their faith, or Buddhist, or maybe both. But then you ask them, how do you live that out in your life? And they'll say, well, I really don't, but I am Buddhist. I do consider myself a person of Shinto faith. And then an interesting part of this whole thing, which led to the Aum Shinrikyo disaster, I believe, is the fact that there is a spiritual vacuum in Japan that's partly coming through in the schools, but also in the home. In Japan, there's a sense that God is not there for them. And there's a lack of moral compass that leads to that. So news media, as they cover stories, tend to tap into these models as explanations for why people act as they do. And the Aum Shinrikyo attack on a subway was part of that. So let me give you some background on why the government mistrusts religion in Japan. The reasons, in many cases, are similar to why this government is skeptical of religion as well. The government in Japan wants to protect and preserve the traditions of Shinto and Buddhist culture. But they don't want to see those engines of religion forcing themselves into government. They distrust anything that pushes itself on the people in an imperial sort of way. Remember that the fear of imperial power? They're saying no religion should force itself on people. And that's how we feel too in this country. That's why Thomas Jefferson said, Congress shall make no law establishing religion. So the Japanese believe that as well. So the government, in responding to Aum Shinrikyo, that your chapter talks about, we're saying that this is a group that is a cult. And they use that word. Prior to this event, the word cult was only used in connection with the Unification Church, the church founded by Sun Myung-moon, a South Korean leader who has enormous power around the world. I don't know if you knew that, but he owns one of the most powerful newspapers in Washington, D.C. The Washington Times is run by the Unification Church. Not anymore? Yeah, so for many, many years, this was a newspaper run by the Unification Church. So what the government said was stay away from this group because they're a cult. And they wanted people to be afraid of it. Okay, let me show you a clip from 60 Minutes that describes the response to Aum Shinrikyo. Just as background, what happened was this group, Aum Shinrikyo, wanted to get the attention of the Japanese people. And to do it, they got together 5 men who worked with 5 drivers. And each of these men took a bag of sarin liquid poison onto the subway, wrapped in newspaper. They each had an umbrella with a really sharp tip. They were instructed to get onto the subway, drop the bag, pierce it with the umbrella, and escape. And they did. 1 drop of sarin gas, liquid that drops on the ground and turns into gas, can kill multiple people if they're close by. One drop. This is a bag of this stuff. And so this gas escaped into the subway, in these subway cars, enclosed space, not much ventilation. 13 people were killed, and hundreds of people were seriously injured by this poisonous gas. All 5 guys were arrested. Several of them were given death sentences. But I want you to see what 60 Minutes described about this, because it kind of puts this in context. As I mentioned, your book talks about the fact that there was this spiritual vacuum. And we as believers know what that's like. American higher education is suffering from a spiritual vacuum, which is why schools like Biola are able to shine brightly, because it's so dark in American higher education today. What is there to believe in a postmodern culture? In Japan, that's the hunger. Young people especially long for a sense of culturally relevant faith. They're not getting that from adults in Japan. They're hungry for it. They're looking outside the culture, and they're finding it in other places. Somebody in missions conference last week said, if you Americans would just live out what you say you believe, other countries would look at that and emulate it, because they have nothing to look for in their culture. Just live it out. Just be transparent in how you live out your faith. And we would add, create some media to display that and send it around the world. That's what's needed in places like Japan. Young people there want to escape from a past that stifles their sense of identity as innovators, as people who have the ability to choose faith. I don't know a lot about Confucian philosophy, but I think there is a sense of inevitability, that the fates have determined this is the way it's going to be with my life. I have no choice. This is how it worked out. And we believe that God intervenes. So young people in that culture long for leadership and an authoritative word from someone who has a sense of spiritual vision. That's why Aum Shinrikyo succeeded. That's why the Branch Davidian cult succeeded in Waco, Texas. And there's comparisons between those two. And so young people in Japan look to the West and the United States for insights into what faith and modernity, or you might say postmodernity, looks like together. And what is so tragic is that evangelical media has not been very successful in describing that, showing what that looks like in pictures, in video, in real time. That's where your generation needs to step up and put it out there. You can provide that in ways that my generation has not. It's a shame. Okay. What has been happening in Japan? It's tragic. So in the interest of time, it's already almost 4:10. Take out a piece of paper, and as you're looking at these images I'm about to show you, I want you to answer this question. And I'm not sure why this is blinking like this. Hopefully I can fix it. But here's the question I want to ask you. How do Americans deal with the suffering of their lives? Is there a sense in which you were allowed in this culture to talk, to describe, to live publicly in your suffering? Or are you forced to suppress your suffering and hide it under a veneer of artificial something else? Okay? So let me show you these images, and as you're taking those notes, if you haven't seen this, it is sobering.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.